never give in. Never, never, never.
Yes, good morning. It's the 6th of June 1999, and that makes it the 55th anniversary of D-Day today.
Yes, it does, indeed.
And there's a gathering of us here at the British Resistance Organisation Museum at Parham in Suffolk. And first of all, can we mention that Ron Chisnell's here once again to help us record the morning's events on behalf of the Chatterbox Club, and thank you very much, Ron. Andy Mothersole was running a video camera for us today to put our meeting on record. And the guest of honour today is Brigadier Geoffrey Beyts. He's asked us to know him as Brigadier Billy today, and so that's the title we're going to use. And Brigadier Beyts, Brigadier Billy, was the second in command of the auxiliary units in 1940-41 and a part of 42. It's that subject we want to deal with today. We've got the chairman of the British Resistance Organisation meeting here as well, Colin Durrant, and his projects officer, Andy Taylor. And supervising us all is Linda Beyts, who's going to make sure that her husband tells us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as far as possible. We're very grateful to you for diverting during a holiday in England, because we know you live in Spain, and taking the opportunity for a regimental reunion, which I suspect must have been at Rajputana Rifles.
That's correct.
And so we welcome you from that reunion to Parham to tell us your memories, as far as you're able, of your days in the auxiliary units. And if we may, we will put guideline questions to you, with the encouragement for you to then expand as you feel best.
I agree.
Andy Taylor's put a lot into this, into sorting out the questions, and we've got one or two points in particular that we hope you'll be able to work out with us. But I better warn you that Andy's a fiend for correct dates, and so he may actually have turned up some papers which will be ahead of your memory. But we're hoping for the best of this. Can I ask Andy to start then, please?
Well, I would like to ask Brigadier Billy if he could tell me, first of all, about his memories of the very early days, in fact the start of Aux units with Colin Gubbins.
Well, as we might expect, a very unusual type that Colin was, Colin Gubbins. He poked his head through the Ministry of Defence officers to find out if there were any Indian Army officers employed by the British Army in the Ministry of Defence, whereupon my name came up. And he said, well, where's he? Well, he's in block so-and-so, side entrance you'll have to go by. So in came Gubbins, and he said, oh, is your name Beyts? And I said, yes, sir. He said, would you be interested in what I call underground warfare? And I said, well, I don't know what that means. He said, well, you're acting entirely on your own ideas on how to get the best out of the war, from the point of view of destroying enemy targets in any way you can get hold of. But we run a course for special branch people, and you will have to attend the course to learn the ropes and what we expect you to do. So I said, I'll ask my wife first of all, if you don't mind, and it happened to be my first wife, who's a Scot. Since then I've married an Irish lady just to make it equal amends. And I had to learn underground warfare, as done in Warsaw, in Poland, where Gubbins happened to be military attaché, and became aware of various things in Germany in regard to getting information across to spies, German spies in Scotland and elsewhere, which you probably may not know. There was certain people who were great friends of allies of Hitler and enjoyed the movement of the youth and doing their stuff. And that took quite a lot of hard work on the part of Gubbins to get right via Winston Churchill, who immediately came to know Gubbins and thought he was just the right type of man to start an organization for underground work against Germany. And that's how really we started with Gubsky, as he was known, starting up a completely new organization which became known as Orcs Units. It was taken, not particularly any reason, but as a different thing to ordinary Army, Navy, Air Force work.
May I just say there that in your book you say Gubbins said that under Churchill's personal direction he was setting up the Orcs Units. Did that remain your firm impression that Churchill was the overlord of Orcs Units?
Yes, indeed, I do. In fact, we gained an enormous amount of pride and wishing to do our level best for England. About Churchill, he was a very masterful man, and we greatly admired him throughout the whole war.
Okay. With regard to when you first started to set the ball in motion, in other words, gathering men together to form these early patrols, I believe you were part of, or in fact, I think you did a great deal of travelling up and down the country to help this thing set up. What are your memories of how these men were trained in the very first few days, and what would you say was their attitude towards the whole thing?
You're going back to the very beginning.
The very beginning, yeah.
I found that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday I was away from headquarters down at Coles Hill in Berkshire, recruiting people from the north of Scotland all the way down the east coast of England, south coast of England. I doubt if I spent any 2 days in any one place. Time was very short. We felt the Germans might arrive at any moment, and therefore there was no time for amusement or anything other than desperately hard work at high speed as we could do. And on this Friday night we started a 2-day course lasting Saturday and Sunday at Coles Hill, mainly on how to compete with Germans arriving under cover of darkness or the part of the world in England which was easy for them to come without giving away their presence. We had to learn also how to blow things up. So the 2 days we had with people coming from all over the United Kingdom soon went, and before you knew where you were off on the next Monday to Friday effort somewhere else. Truly, I don't think I slept other than odd snatches of sleep for at least the first year. It was very hard going, but I was very young and very determined that we should do something anti-Hitler, which was recorded in David Lampy's book, which I think you all read.
The civilians who were recruited as Orcs Unit patrols wouldn't have had very much cover under conventions of war, I suspect. The officers who trained them would, generally speaking, have been in uniform and would have had proper protection under wartime conventions. Am I right in assuming that at the outset those men that were recruited to go in underground patrols, OBs, were not protected by conventions of war?
I think you're asking a very, very good question. We did in fact find more difficulties in our way of recruitment. And they said, well, are we covered? Do we wear uniform? What is it? People are prepared to risk their lives in the common cause. They actually want to know a little bit about the legality of what status they held in common practice. And Churchill himself personally gave a directive that they should be free of being charged as doing things wrong by the police or whatever it might be in the middle of the night, somebody breaks a glass or whatever their training might involve. Yes, indeed, it's a good question you raised. Early part, we did have a certain amount of people saying, well, I'll join if it's a legal thing.
Yes. They were required to be of a very particular quality of bravery, I think, to volunteer to stay behind after enemy invasion.
I think the word bravery doesn't come into it at this point. I think patriotism is really the word. One did it for the sake of Britain. Believe it or not, we felt very, very responsible for Britain's safety, because Hitler, as you know, was all for youth. The flower of his army, Navy, Air Force were all very young people. And in fact, in the book I referred to earlier, there was a list of people who were going to be shot. They were practically all schoolmasters and scholastic people, reflecting Hitler's idea of youth, and therefore the youth of Britain would be the first to be knocked out. Anyone dealing with youth. Almost incredible, really. That there's a list of headmasters and schoolmasters was in my actually possession. That's where to go. So we were able to warn all the people whose names I had to join Orcs units and be prepared to defend themselves as well as the country.
Do you remember how the members of the patrols were vetted? Were they vetted in any way for suitability?
No, I don't record that. We were glad to get anyone, quite honestly. And should they not meet the needs as we thought, they were told, well, I don't think this is the sort of thing that you'll do. You'll do very well.
I think I'm right in saying without any doubt that the word secrecy was paramount in the planning at all stages.
Yes, it certainly was, and it's really remarkable because most of us talk far too much anyway. But some great deal of Churchill really, I think, sponsored this idea of being secret. Don't allow your names to be taken by anyone unless they're authorized to do so. And the police, of course, were also well versed in what was going on, because things used to happen in darkness and so on, and create alarm and despondency with the local people who hadn't joined or didn't know.
There's been a lot of discussion amongst researchers over recently as to whether, especially in the early days, the days that we're involved in at the moment, as to whether the men in the patrols were actually formally enrolled in anything, or the Home Guard especially. In your opinion, was auxiliary units part of the Home Guard, or was it a totally separate thing within Home Forces?
It's, believe it or not, quite different. We wore their uniform, but we didn't share the same objectives somehow. We were invited to train the Home Guard, some more skilled people like Andrew Croft, for example. And they would borrow him, as it were, for a month or whatever it was, so as to let the true Home Guard learn a little bit about underground stuff that would be certainly used against them in the event of an invasion. And we were quite different, really. We wore the same uniform, yes. And the uniform was to protect our lives in the event of capture or whatever. but in other respects we didn't really meet one another much.
So in that respect, David Lamp was correct in his book, in his assessment of the whole auxiliary units organisation, when he said that the Home Guard was just a cover to allow Orcs units to go about their business.
I think that's pretty well,
Yeah.
very true, I think.
When you were of course responsible for training mostly, or settled down to the training routine in due course, but were you involved at all with the selection and creation of the operational bases from which the patrols operated?
No, I wish I could say I was. I think they were absolutely marvellous. The inventiveness and the methods used to create these OBs and other things, and creating some sensible way of living under warfare conditions. I wish I could say I had anything to do with it, because I think that was almost the best thing we did.
Still evidences of the impression that there was no general liaison between auxiliary units at Coleshill and the Royal Engineers, that it was very much done on a local basis, and as the Royal Engineers were responsible for much of the digging anyway, and the design of much of the many of the OBs, it does seem as a strong likelihood that there was a local arrangement between Orcs units intelligence officers and senior officers of the Royal Engineers. Was that your impression?
Looking back on it, I think I do agree with that. We didn't like to be told what to do unless it had our own support. We felt that the Royal Engineers were people quite apart and were army people, and wouldn't understand the conditions which we were trying to achieve. Yes, I think in a way we didn't like using or misusing the Royal Engineers, not for any criticism of the Royal Engineers, but they had a different role.
You may be interested to know that they're one of the few organisations that haven't come up with any data to assist us in creating this museum. No designs of OBs, they've not responded to us in any positive way, so I think that does lend support to the idea that much of it was done on a local level, albeit at a very skillful level, because the trapdoors in particular were extremely skillful.
Indeed, they were.
I think in the early days, from what we can gather from our research, the trapdoors, while we're on that subject, were very rudimentary. I don't know if do you remember them as being such? That
well,
I think these very convoluted designs came in a little bit later, perhaps in sort of from 41 onwards.
There was a great deal of inventiveness through it.
Yeah.
It appealed to certain types of people. I, for one, wouldn't have known how to make a base or anything, but then somebody else would, and they enjoyed doing it. And somehow it created a sense of pride in what they were doing, and so on.
I think you must have achieved a very high standard of training, because our impression from all the auxiliaries that we've met is that they remember to this day the colour codes of the time pencils, the speed of burning of the different fuses, the different effects of the different explosives in different places, how to make pebble bombs and nail bombs and all sorts of paraphernalia that they put together themselves, as well as the stuff that was supplied to them. And you've no idea how accurate their memory is even to this day. I think you may have been responsible for some of that.
No, I wouldn't like to shoot a line about it, but everyone became so very personally interested in their work. I think that's partly explains why the Royal Engineers weren't called in very often, because people were so inventive. They liked doing things, calling it somebody's bomb or somebody's time pencil or whatever. It appeals to certain type of people who like to be original and working successfully to make the thing go with a bang, as it were. I've been asked a question which whether I'm going to be asked or not. How is it I was always trying to get people to work at night, quietly and so on. And I learnt all about that out in India. When a great friend of mine called Jim Corbett, who wrote a book, and he taught me how to make bird noises and animal noises and how to tread softly at night against animals, wild game and so on. So,
and you've seen a lot of active service. Most of the British Army had not seen any active service, but you had been active service as early as the early 1930s in the Far East, and had actually received a medal for it.
mm-hmm.
Medal for Valour. So you had a lot to offer the Yorkshire units, I think.
I was jolly lucky because I joined my father's regiment in the Indian Army, and I was told to make sure I didn't do my father's name any harm, and so on. And before I was there, more than 2 or 3 months at the most, we were sent to Burma to put down an operation which is to get rid of the British out of Burma. And I found myself only about one month's service in the Indian Army, aged about 19, rising 20. And I was there for a solid year without speaking a word of English to anybody. And training and getting hold of anyone who was behind the idea of getting rid of Britain from Burma, for which I quite honestly, I don't think I deserved the military cross, but I certainly learned a lot about Burma, which was very useful to me during the last war.
And you were able to pass a lot of this on to the Yorkshire units. They still talk about their night work and their map reading and their stealth at night and how to camouflage themselves at night, and without encouraging you to take entire responsibility for this, I think you were very much involved with it.
Well, thank you very much for the compliment. It was not work to me, it was quite normal, as they say in Spain. It's not difficult to realize. You've got to be very quiet, and you break a twig, it might mean your death. You've got to show originality in your approach to whatever work it is. When I was young in the Burma show, I used to pretend that unless people in the village were to give the truth, they'd all be shot, or that sort of thing. And I'd string up one of them over a tree, and after about, I think there's a time to call it, how long you do it before you lose consciousness when you're tied up under a tree. I'd have him cut down straight away and body removed, and a hospital rum would be rammed down his throat, so he'd be perfectly well. But then the whole village would have come forward, hoping that they were going to save the boy's life or whatever, and out came the truth. Well, I'm saying this at this meeting because one has to be inventive. One has to think of things in different ways, never twice in the same way. Try and create a sense of bewilderment amongst the enemy, and so on. So it doesn't really matter what age you are, it's a question of whether you've got imagination.
Just returning to Colin Gubbins himself, do you have any memories of Gubbins actually visiting the areas during the early days of Orcs units? In fact, during his time with Orcs units, did he have much contact with the areas and the men involved?
That's a good question. I can't truthfully say that he did in any way. He was so involved in London. He's a great friend of Churchill's. I can't truthfully say that he in any way impinged his character upon us, but we had a most enormous admiration for what he did. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the war, he was knighted and thoroughly deserved his honour. A most unusual man. I was asked the other day, did he have a sense of humour? And the answer is no. He never smiled. He never laughed, and yet he looked you straight in the face and said, "Well, you're no bloody good," or you should do well if you were to come under me, and I'll tell you what we need you for, and so on. So he was a very unusual character, a very wonderful man to work under, though.
And he was at Coles Hill during the training periods, at the weekend periods. Do you know whether he took any sort of active or any close participation with the training of the men? In other words, would they have seen Colin Gubbins at Coles Hill?
Very rarely. Good question, I think. No, you didn't become a Colin Gubbins man unless you were an Andrew Croft man or any other instructor of ours. He wouldn't have enjoyed being an instructor if he didn't have the inventiveness and the wish to pass on his knowledge, whatever it might have been. I must say I don't think I saw Colin Gubbins very often, very seldom in fact, when I look back on it. He's a tremendous authority on underground warfare, as we all know.
We've got the impression that he picked his men and then delegated.
Yes, indeed. I think that's the height of good sense.
Yes.
Otherwise it completely cripples anyone's inventiveness. They don't know what to do next unless they're told. And that is the worst possible way of doing underground warfare. You've got to do it all yourself.
David Lampy writes about the arrival of the Orcs units coming to Coles Hill for training purposes. They were mainly to be sergeants and corporals, I think, although you had some of the privates and the patrols come as well from our experience. But they all arrived at Highworth Sub Post Office, where they spoke to the lady postmistress and were then diverted to Coles Hill in a 490 staff car or something like that.
Yes, that's quite right. They all had to go to the Highworth Post Office, and where they then be told what to do next. And we owe a great debt to the lady who ran the post office. She entered into the spirit of it tremendously well. And if you haven't proceed a little further in your question, we all had to live in stables. There was no bedroom accommodation or anything like that. There was all the stables where the horses used to be. And that's where my wife and the other ladies' wives would clean the place up after every weekend and do the cooking and that sort of thing.
So Coles Hill didn't have a full staff of servants then, or batmen. It was something of an ad hoc arrangement then, wasn't it?
Yes, there was no such luxury as a batman,
Uh-huh.
or a batwoman. No, we had our very loyal wives who did all the dirty work, really.
Well, that's pretty unusual in any army circle, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And when Colin Gubbins went on to SOE, you remained there at Coles Hill under Bill Major then, did you?
Yes,
Colonel
indeed.
Major, did you?
Yes, Colonel Bill Major. He's a very different type, very correct. I remember he wore leather gaiters, beautifully polished and so on. He was a typical military information officer, very correct, and insistent on the good turnout and cleanliness and so on. And I gather he went on from there during the end of the war to Africa, into Central Africa. I think he became an MI chap there. But we all got, he's a completely different character to Colin Gubbins, but a very likeable man. And
Doesn't seem to be much on record about him. I don't think he wrote a book. Or?
He didn't really enter into our lives very much. He was more or less an administrative officer in charge of Coles Hill.
This left you with a great deal of responsibility.
Yes, indeed, and which I think has helped me enormously. I didn't know what to do when I started, and it grew as we went along.
Could you tell me a little about the Western Isles? I remember that before we started the interview, you mentioned a little story about German U-boats in the Western Isles.
Well, it's very amusing. The Western Isles were what I call Outer Hebrides. And I discovered by going around as we did week after week after week that no one had ever been to the Outer Hebrides. So I went to the Outer Hebrides for about 3 weeks. And sure enough, the U-boats were always there charging batteries. There was a lot of ignorance amongst the local people who didn't know much about the war and didn't want to enter the war in any way. And it became very obvious because the U-boat sinking of our shipping in the Atlantic was absolutely terrible. And very greatly was due, not only to the charging of batteries with utter freedom completely to do it. A submarine is very vulnerable whilst it's going on. And also in Southern Ireland, who never went to the war. And when I eventually flew out to India, after my time with Orcs Unit, I took the post bag to Lisbon, tied to my wrist, on no account to leave the place on the aeroplane. It was a seaplane that took me to there, and there was nothing but German voices all the time, which I duly reported. And they said, "That's our old hat, we know perfectly well, they're always there." And I was tabled from the arrival on the River Tagus all the way to have a swim in the sea and back again. And I realized how very strong influence the Germans had on certain types of people. I was absolutely amazed about the German presence on the coastal island, Southern Ireland.
So I believe you were the first person to report the presence of the U-boats in the Western Isles.
Yes, I think I was. The Navy didn't seem to know a damn thing, or at least bit interested, as far as I could judge, until I discovered one submarine, German submarine, in the fading light of day, exactly what I had already told the Royal Navy, that they were charging their batteries night after night after night. And I only had a revolver with me, and by absolute fluke, I knocked the periscope out with one shot. Whereupon all further battery charging ceased for quite a while. And the Royal Navy were very grateful. And after that, probably that's the reason they took some notice of it. And German submarines ceased to exist after a bit.
So the story in David Lamb's book, The Last Edge, about I believe it was at Captain Island. I don't know. I can't remember his rank off the top of my head. Swimming out to a U-boat with a limpet mine strapped on his chest. So that really sort of was a direct result of your report of these things actually being there in the first place.
I'd be glad to think it was, but I had no proof, and I certainly wouldn't have been brave enough to have done that. No.
Did you ever hear about that story? I know that Lamb himself couldn't verify the story, but I think he was told it by an Orcs Unit's officer, I think.
I can't say it. No.
I know the patrols were your speciality and the training of the patrols, but in your book, The King's Salt, you did mention in one paragraph, within 6 months from the start, the entire coastline had been covered. That was the formation of patrols and the beginning of the OBs, no doubt. We had to establish wireless a network of our own. This was achieved under the genius of Maurice Petherick, and with the help of Beatrice Temple. Now, Maurice Petherick is another character who went to ground after the war. He'd been a member of Parliament, and he died fairly young, I believe, relatively young, but he was a genius, I think. You called him a genius, and that was
He was
a
indeed.
special task.
Well, he was a special branch type, an excellent man at the work. And Miss Temple was a niece of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and under their joint control, they created the ability to record the signals and things coming from Hitler and so on, as to which place to go to next and so on. They completely decoded all his messages from the time they started work with AUX units. And one can't lay claim in AUX units that it was an AUX unit job. It was a special branch job, and that's how you'll find their names will come out very sensibly and very quite carefully. It wasn't given away.
You opened up a whole new slice of information to us there, because I don't think we had realised, either from David Lampy's book or from other sources, which are very limited by the way, that there was a listening role which finished up at Coleshill or Hannington Hall next door under Maurice Petherick, a listening role.
Very definitely there was. I've forgotten what the strength of the ladies were. I think about 50 ladies, all very well trained. They started work at a place in Harrods stores in London to get to know what the work was, especially put apart. And they had their meals and so on in Harrods and around there. And they were very special, and you were never, if you saw them and spoke to them, it would only be a nice day, isn't it, sort of thing. They never confided in anybody, and they say it had been very carefully vetted indeed. And I think Miss Temple was rewarded with some degree or other, I don't know. But she was a niece of the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time.
I think she became a dame, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. Certainly became the mayor of Lewes after the war, amongst other things. But Maurice Petherick, do you remember anything of him? Did you meet him at all? Was he in your mess?
Yes, he was. There's no doubt about it. He wasn't one of our type. He was, shall we say, secretive, perhaps in a way. But I found any people in MI6 or MI5 these days, they don't blurt out what they're doing or talking about their work. But I wouldn't say you could make a special friend of the people in the Secret Service or that. They're always on their guard that they're not being made use of.
Did he? I think he operated from Hannington Hall, which was near to Coleshill. Did he not? Did he mess with you in Coleshill?
No, Hannington Hall ran their own Coleshill, as it was, for their people. They were overall AUX units, yes, but I mean they were special branch AUX units. They didn't want to be involved in AUX units' work, as it were.
Your side of it was perhaps more operational. Theirs was perhaps more intelligence
That's
gathering.
very well put. That explains it exactly.
Yes.
With regard to, if we come on to Nigel Oxenden, obviously you knew Nigel Oxenden when he was an IO in Norfolk, I believe. He went, he went on to write the official history. And the thing that we found very strange about at least the early draft that we discovered, was that Nigel Oxenden, right up to his death in 1948, differentiated entirely between what he saw as auxiliary units and special duties. He didn't seem to link directly the two under the one heading of AUX units. Would you say that was accurate?
I think it's quite accurate. Yeah. We felt that the special branch were a different breed of person. They had to be secretive. They couldn't blurt out that they would play round of golf and they'd have to stop at the third hole or something in order to get on with the job of coding messages to Hitler, or decoding rather. No, we didn't speak the same language really. Yeah. I think Oxenden was quite right.
And of course the special duties section, if you like to call it that, had their own intelligence officers in various areas around the country as well.
Indeed,
Did you have any contact with those people at all?
No, none at all.
So they really were quite separate in actual fact.
They were absolutely separate, yes.
And do you think that Colonel or Colin Gubbins was in any way their CO? Was he the CO of the Special Duties Section as well, or was that led by somebody else?
I think they worked for Colin Gubbins, as it were, and he owed them, therefore, his support and help. But in no way did he direct them to say this, that, or the other in their messages. But he was, of course, absolutely directly interested in what they found out what the Germans were doing in their signals. We
certainly know, well, we believe now that by 1943 both sections, and I mean Orcs units and Special Duties, had actually come together under one commander. And we know that the last commander, who wrote the Colonel Douglas, who wrote the stand-down letters, was in actual fact the CO of both organisations. But we think that possibly happened in 43, which was obviously after your time. So
yes, it was after my time. I can't say that I can say one or the other.
Yeah.
Could I take you back to the patrols for a moment? As I understand it, by the time your training was well underway and the OBs were created for the auxiliary units patrols around the coastline, they had no communication. If they had stayed behind after German invasion, they would have had no communication with any senior officer. They didn't have a radio network of their own, did they?
If the Germans had managed to land and overcome Britain, there was no resistance that we could have put up, other than very temporary and very minor. As you know, they went in for the youth movement, for the protection of Hitler and everything else they did. They defined their field marshals. Some young squirt would say, well, I don't think we would allow invasion of Tibet or somewhere else. He had a great desire to make youth his supreme reason for being Hitler. And therefore, if he had landed in England or any of his people, they'd have gone slap into the school headmaster type of people who would have been probably shot out of hand.
But your patrols would have been left behind quite properly, if that's what you've trained them for. They would have probably come out, the word that's often used is to create mayhem behind the lines, providing that the fight was still going on. They would have not been able to refer upwards at all, would they? They would have not been able to say, well, we think we've got a target, would it be alright if we blow it up? They would have selected and taken out their own targets, we feel, the ammunition dumps, petrol dumps, so on and so forth.
Yes, I think you're talking about something which, thank God, never happened.
Yes.
Had it happened, I think we would have crumpled up. I think odd patches of people would fight to the end. The last ditch, as you know, the name ditch, was the canal. Was it the Bristol Canal or whatever, which had, you could say it was about 30, 40 miles, I think, in length, and you would have operated had this terrible thing happened, fighting the last ditch, as it were, these last 30, 40 miles of breastworks set up for the last fight. I don't think we would have lasted very long.
But your men would have been underground until we might have capitulated, but up to that time your men would have been left behind underground and in enemy territory.
Yes, shot out of hand.
Shot out of hand if captured. That would have been the probability, wouldn't it?
Absolutely certain, yeah.
Did they get any instructions from Coleshill at all about their right, their authority to eliminate British collaborators? If any Britons were collaborating with the Germans, as happened so frequently in France, were the auxiliary units patrols, as far as you're aware, given any authority to take out, to use a modern word, to eliminate collaborators?
No, I'm afraid I was not aware that they would.
No.
I do know that in France it's a very difficult thing indeed.
I would like to just talk about Nigel Oxenden's official history, because until just a few years ago that was totally unknown to anybody that this thing has ever been written. First of all, with regard to the early draft that we found, the museum found about 2 years ago and published, and I believe you've read it. How accurate would you say that is with regard to the history of auctions?
I would say it's absolutely accurate. It wasn't written in a romantic way and in a shooting a line or anything like that. I thought it was very practical, sound sense, and what we practice. I think it's well worthwhile, that book.
And we also know that document actually contained 8,500 words, and we do know from letters written after the war that Oxenden's final version of that history was actually 20,000 words, as placed with the War Office. And would you have any ideas what would have made up the difference? In other words, what is in the end document?
Yes, good question. I would say it was a completely different author who got hold of it and decided that it didn't contain enough facts, and that therefore it added a certain element to it.
Well, Oxenden actually states in letters that he wrote the original, the final one also. So your idea would be that he basically might have gone back to the drawing board and produced a more
I think that's
wide-ranging.
Yes,
document.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Yeah. I just think of one particular thing. There's been a lot of talk, especially from David Lamb's book, about the Countryman's Diary, the famous auctioneer's textbook. Nigel Oxenden in his history suggests that it actually wasn't produced until 1943 at least. Did you have any knowledge of the Countryman's Diary as a textbook up until you left?
No, I can't say I did. I can't remember how I got hold of my copy now, looking back on it. I had never met David Lampe. I think he was a Danish gentleman, if I remember.
Well, as far as we know, he was American. He was born in Maryland, in the USA.
Yes.
I know he had some connection with Denmark, as far as we're aware, but we don't quite know what that was.
Well, one must remember that he was a writer of books. He wasn't necessarily a person who did work of auctions.
Yeah.
So if any discrepancies are, that's due to the fact he wasn't personally involved in auctions work.
So until you left in July the 2nd, 1942, the textbooks that you would have had any knowledge of with training textbooks for auctioneers would have been the 1937 calendar, and perhaps the 1938 calendar, perhaps.
That's all.
And so, that would verify our thoughts on that. The Countryman's Diary was much later.
And anyone who wrote about it thereafter must be excused for getting it wrong, including myself.
Yeah. But there was with regard to you leaving in 1942, that is very interesting with regard to the Countryman's Diary, anyway.
Yes. It's quite remarkable to call it the Countryman's Diary, quite honestly.
Very tongue-in-cheek as far as I'm concerned. Before we conclude, would you, if I could find your picture, I found it a little while ago, now I've lost it again. Would you care to sign above your photograph in our copy of The Last Ditch?
Certainly, yes.
Okay.
Right.
Well, while I'm doing that, I'll thank Linda and Jeffrey Beyts.
I'm going to put Billy Bates to that.
For coming to see us today. Very many thanks. And,
that's interesting.
this is a very valuable contribution to our records, if I may say so. And if we're very lucky, we shall have Barbara Cullerton type it out for us. She's doing a great deal of work for us, and
I did write to her.
You did indeed, and when that's done, we'll see you get a copy of it.
Oh, I'm very grateful.
Yes, you'll get a copy of it.
Very grateful.
Is there any chance? Are we off? Is there any chance that you are likely to be here next year? Because we're very strongly proposing to have a what is called a final reunion
Yes.
of the auxiliary units here in July of next year.
Yes.
Well, could we ask you to think seriously about it anyway?
Better ask the chap up in the heavens.
I'm going to have a word with him, and also with the Rajputana Rifles to see if they can arrange a reunion at the appropriate time again next year.
Oh, that's very thoughtful of you. I must say I'm very glad to have been able to come here, because I was almost dead. I have been there on the point of death.
I didn't know that.
And I'd rather not say, yes, definitely I'll be here. Otherwise, that's asking for trouble.
It's asking for trouble, but if you could bear it in mind, we'd be very pleased, obviously, if you were both able to make it.
I'm most awfully grateful.
And thank you very much indeed for coming to the museum today. We're very grateful.
Oh, thank you.